Hi everyone. This session is mental rehearsal, visualizing failure to ensure you're ready and prepared, from Ian McDonald. If you have any questions during the session, please put them in the chat. If there's an opportunity to break into the presentation, I will do and pass your questions on. Else, there'll be a part at the end where we can do question and answer. Okay. So Ian, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Anna. So firstly, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Ian McDonald. So this session is part of your GSE UK 2020 Virtually Unstoppable Conference. So pleased to be contributing. As Anna said, there will be time for questions. So if you do want to submit stuff on chat, we'll endeavour to answer those at the end. If this topic is actually of some interest, there is actually a detailed paper which I can provide on request. So there will be some contact details at the end should anyone wish to get any additional information. Okay, so a little bit about me. I won't labour this too much. So I've been in IT some 40 years. 32 of those have been sort of around financial services in the UK. In 2015, I decided to leave the corporate world and set up as an independent consultant. During my time in IT, I've been fortunate to sort of participate and be part of a number of different industry bodies in the spirit of give and take. You'll probably notice the GSE logo. I actually did 5 years in the 90s. Working on the programs for the European conferences, so pleased to be back. I do conference speaking, hence today. And if I did have a claim to fame, I didn't have an agent and I don't get royalties, but I am actually an ITIL accredited author. Okay, so let's set the scene for the presentation. So we sort of start with the modern IT environment. So today's business services, we need an environment that has this characteristic of a low frequency of failure. And in the context of IT restart and recovery, whilst the modern IT environment is good, more uptime, less downtime, actually from a restart recovery skills perspective, dealing with significant failures and exceptions now is reducing. So our frontline staff have maybe limited opportunity now to sort of practice and execute sort of IT restart and recovery. And probably also of concern is those cognitive skills, those things we draw on when we're faced with maybe problems and challenges to work our way through. Those are being used less and less as well. So if practice makes perfect, then is skills degradation, this sort of gradual erosion of our sort of skill sets around restart and recovery, is that a concern? Is there actually any evidence to suggest this is actually an emerging issue? And if it is, then what sort of approaches can we take to provide the opportunity for those sort of skill sets, those cognitive skills, to be sort of honed and ready and prepared when dealing with infrequent failures? So that's the sort of the session sort of scene set. So the modern IT environment. So in today's, I say, modern business world, digital services, there is this commercial imperative now for availability and reliability. I guess it's true ever more so now that when IT stops, the business stops. So that's driving naturally a strong focus on design around fault tolerance and resilience. We're using more and more monitoring and sort of event management to sort of monitor, detect issues in the IT infrastructure, and using more and more automation now to sort of make those machine speed sort of decisions, corrective actions without human intervention. In extremis, when things go badly wrong, then today's modern service continuity solutions should provide fast recovery with minimal or in some cases no data loss. And of course, for those extremist situations, we need thorough recovery plans and procedures to deal with those exceptions. So for the modern IT environment, for the IT service provider, dealing with significant IT failure should now be an infrequent exception. However, is there an unforeseen consequence? So we said before, dealing with failure is an exception rather than the norm. Over time, we have a reliance and trust that automation will sort of detect and correct all exceptions. And automation becomes more critical because in reality, over time, we sort of forget how to do things manually. So if the automation fails, quite often we have no experience of how to actually perform some of these activities in a manual sort of way, or the documentation is not comprehensive enough. And back to the cognitive skills, those decision-making sort of skill sets, we're no longer able to often draw on our sort of personal knowledge bank of experience. Yeah. And so when we're faced with challenges, sometimes we're having to make decisions because we've not seen this sort of thing before. So, is there a link to skills degradation and the modern IT environment? Well, if skills is defined as an ability to do a job well, because it's practiced, then maybe in the modern IT environment, we do have a challenge here where the opportunity for practice and execution is now significantly reduced. So I pose the question, does mental rehearsal offer a practical option? So what is mental rehearsal? So mental rehearsal in simple terms is actually, performing an activity, a process, a procedure in the mind, in the brain, thinking something through. This has been around for many years, often associated with the sporting and athletics sort of field. So maybe before a big event, an athlete may practice, for example, handing over the baton in a relay race, or maybe a footballer before a cup final practices in his mind, taking a penalty in a penalty shootout, hopefully to score and maybe win the competition. And of course, actually, mental rehearsal is something we can all do. And actually, we've all used it. Yeah, we probably don't recognize it as mental rehearsal, but I bet there's been situations where you've imagined, for example, delivering a presentation, maybe in a couple of days' time, to a large audience or to a senior management team. You've probably visualized how you're going to perform at an important meeting where maybe you want to get a key decision in your favor. You've probably thought about how you're going to handle maybe an important job interview, either as the interviewer or the interviewee. And you've probably anticipated, what we're going to do should certain issues materialize with an implementation or a big project. And observation is also something we use where we observe how other people do things and think, how could we actually adopt and adapt that, and think about how we could use that. So it isn't actually something that's restricted to a particular sort of field. We can all use it. And the reason that we sort of propose mental rehearsal as a potential candidate for replacing this sort of regular practice and execution is that when you look at the sort of the studies behind sort of mental rehearsal, one of the things they bring out is that actually from a brain, from a neurological perspective, practicing something in the brain is very little different from actually performing it actually physically. So the brain makes little distinction. So, for example, doing something in the brain where you're successful can create a degree of confidence, even though you've not actually done it. So that's quite interesting in that actually, from a brain perspective, a neurological perspective, maybe the distinction between practice in the brain and practice physically, there's not a lot of difference. So that might be something we want to look at. So we're still talking about this skills degradation and the modern IT environment, and does it exist? Okay, so if we need to sort of validate this, maybe the first step is let's create a hypothesis where we say the low frequency of failure and increasing exploitation of automation is resulting in skills degradation, of our IT staff. Okay, so we've got that. So what we need to do is test that, validate that, find the sort of hard sort of empirical evidence that says actually we can see a link. So to try and do that, I've looked at quite a number of sort of high visibility outages, things that have gained quite a lot of media coverage, and also looked at a number of different independent IT surveys and research reports and journals, again, to see whether there's any evidence that suggests that issues today can be linked to this skills degradation. Because if we can find that, then clearly we've got a good, compelling case to now consider actually thinking about how we might use mental rehearsal. So let's look at the evidence that we found. Okay, so this slide, normally with these sort of slides, you get people arguing that their company logo should be on it. But in this case, this is about organizations and brands that have been in the spotlight for probably the wrong reasons. So there's no particular industry bias or sort of negative bias here. I just did a couple of simple internet searches for major IT outages. So over the last sort of 2 years, these were the 20 that I picked up. There were more. I just used these for illustration. And when you look at the actual sort of media coverage of these, one thing that becomes quite clear is the sort of customer frustration, the customer sort of angst, and the impact that's been caused by a lot of these services not being available. What you tend to observe, I think, today in the modern sort of social media world is that people are more likely to sort of vent their anger on Twitter or Facebook than they are to pick up the phone and speak to maybe their bank or service provider, which is interesting. The longer these outages go on, then of course they become of interest to mainstream media, which then compounds that sort of brand and reputational damage. However, when you try and sort of find sort of what's gone on, well, naturally, a lot of companies are reluctant to put anything into the public domain. So what caused it? What were the contributory factors? Why did it take so long to get the service back? Quite often, there's not a lot of real sort of evidence in there that you can use. Typically, the media put these outages down as a computer glitch, which doesn't really help our particular investigation. One of the general observations when we look at downtime, so those 20 outages, on average, the outages were over 12 hours. Okay, so that's quite significant. Some were a lot more, some were actually over days, some might have been 7 or 8 hours, but overall the average was around 12 hours, which is quite significant, I think, in the context of the modern IT environment. So, okay, so we might not find the hard evidence we want from the media sort of coverage. So let's look at what's being sort of reported in sort of the industry. So what are the issues and trends that are being sort of reported in, let's say, those sort of surveys and research documents and journals? So I looked at a number of different sources, independent surveys over a number of recent years. And what came out consistently in terms of the sort of top ranked cause or risk around sort of service availability was human error. Okay, so maybe there's a factor here. Human error, some of that might be due to a lack of familiarity. Is there any more information we can gain, again, to sort of back up our hypothesis? One of the observations I did make when looking at those high visibility outages, and this is where the industry surveys may offer some insight, but as I said before, these outages spanned quite a significant amount of time. And there were a number of brands up there which you would assume would have invested in those sort of service continuity solutions, which would have got services back, reasonably quickly. And that didn't happen. So why was that? If we look at the surveys, one of the questions asked to this particular sort of target group was how often do you test your disaster recovery procedures? And over 65% said, well, once a year, and actually quite a few said considerably less. So that's interesting in terms of familiarity. And then when you look at the solutions which are designed now to meet sort of fairly, stringent recovery targets, both in terms of getting the service back and in terms of data integrity, the actual performance, again, from the survey, from customers responding to the survey, the actual performance attainment against those targets is pretty poor. So again, could this be a lack of practice and therefore confidence? The confidence to actually invoke may be impacted, or having invoked, could this lack of practice perhaps result in errors and mistakes during failover? So again, probably circumstantial in terms of the evidence, but there's clearly possibly something going on here. Now, when we look at the wider sort of journals, again, you find many examples reported of sort of human error, where we must assume reasonably well trained, skilled, professional IT personnel have at face value done something which looks a little bit silly and has caused major sort of impact to the services they provide to their customers. And it's probably worth mentioning as a footnote at this stage that human error I don't associate with incompetency, because if it was, then I would say sack the managers and the IT leadership for recruiting people who are not up to it. So we must assume that there's something more fundamental going on here. So humans can make mistakes for lots of reasons. Okay, lack of familiarity, can result in poor sort of problem solving, bad decision making, maybe identifying the wrong sort of corrective actions, or maybe the right corrective actions, but executing them maybe inappropriately. So again, there's something going on here, and lack of familiarity could be a factor in some of these what appear to be at face value pretty basic mistakes. However, as a hypothesis, whilst I think we've got a lot of strong circumstantial evidence to suggest there may well be a link here, it's not the sort of what I'd call the empirical evidence, the hard evidence that would validate it. And I think some of that might be that just as an industry ourselves, we're a little bit immature yet, that we haven't perhaps recognized this issue. So when we ask the survey questions, we don't include things which give us perhaps a better breakdown of what was behind human error. So we don't have that sort of empirical sort of detailed data. So that might be just a case of where we are. So at this stage, we could either pack up and go home and say, well, actually, we can't prove it, or we can look at another industry, where maybe there is evidence that low frequency of failure and automation can over time result in skills degradation. And the industry we looked at was the aviation industry. Now, the aviation industry have been at the fore of sort of resilient design and extensive use of monitoring and automation for decades. Okay, and in today's modern sort of cockpit, it's really the automation that flies the plane. Pilots routinely do very, very little actual flying. The role is mainly supervisory. And so if this sort of modern environment of a low frequency of failure, i.e., high degree of reliability and resilience, together with automation performing routine and error sort of corrections, then maybe we would see skills degradation in this environment, particularly with regard to pilots. So when we look at the aviation industry, it's actually quite a good match in terms of IT. We both share that commercial imperative for reliability, and with a strong focus on fault tolerance and resilience. Again, with the extensive use of monitoring and automation. I guess today's modern airliner is a flying computer in all but name. And of course, both industries have to sort of prepare for occasional extreme situations where we might need to actually execute documented procedures and plans to deal with exceptions, such as an aircraft ditching and needing to evacuate the plane with all passengers safely off in 90 seconds, as an example. So we share some common ground, and there's also some other common ground. So when we started to look at the aviation industry and look for perhaps evidence of this skills degradation in pilots, what became clear as a theme was a real concern on the impact of automation with regard to pilot skills. It still continues today to be a real area of concern. And, I said before, 90% of a typical flight now is performed by automation. And so when you look at some of the other stats around the industry, there's another area we share, which is this number one highest cause of accidents or incidents in our parlance, down to human error. And when you look at the sort of trend line at the bottom, you can see that actually the sort of instances of pilot error as a percentage of air accidents has started to increase slowly but steadily, decade by decade since the 80s. And maybe as an observation, we can also align to that, maybe as automation has got more comprehensive and more sophisticated on a decade by decade basis, that in turn is a factor. So there's clearly an issue here, I think, with sort of skills degradation for pilots, and recognised as a concern. And to that extent, when obviously there is a major sort of air crash and often significant fatalities, there's always a detailed sort of air crash investigation trying to get to root cause, but also other contributory factors. One of the things you do observe in the airline industry is that these investigations definitely do not have a sort of a blame culture associated with them. So even though you've got a high percentage of these air crash sort of fatalities and instances being attributed to pilot error or human error, these investigations always take the view that pilots are highly trained, highly skilled, very experienced sort of professionals. So what led them to make a mistake, okay, which is quite interesting. There's never this sort of, well, it's a pilot error and we'll sort of write it off. They really do want to understand why mistakes are being made. And so there's been numerous studies performed on sort of pilot skills degradation. Some of these have been instigated by the actual air safety sort of boards themselves. Some have been sponsored by universities, organizations such as NASA have undertaken studies, and the airline manufacturers as well. So there's been quite a lot of research done into skills degradation, and what comes out, and I won't sort of read those bullets line by line, but what's come out is clear sort of scientifically proven evidence that there is a definite link between the modern environment, of high reliability and automation, and potential skills degradation over time of pilots, particularly in the area of the cognitive skills. This is where, automation either hasn't worked and the airline pilot has to stand in and do stuff, or the pilot is dealing with a situation maybe that automation hasn't actually catered for. And so this is more than skills becoming ring rusty. This is actually the ability to actually correlate, link particular sort of situations and indicators, start to, work out sort of the situation and start the problem solving sort of process. So definite evidence there. And I think from a hypothesis point of view, I would say that there's a tick in the box there in terms of a link we've established between that modern environment and automation, which, although at the moment in the IT industry is pretty much circumstantial, we've got the hard evidence in the aviation industry. So what's the aviation industry done about this? So, of course, clearly outputs from a lot of these studies and research programs obviously need to look at how this risk is mitigated. So there's a lot of focus now on how to improve and give pilots the opportunity to sort of become familiar with particularly the emergency procedures. So when a pilot is eventually fully trained and is in service, then there is a requirement for this sort of biannual recurrent training program, where the focus is perhaps less on the manual flying skills, but more on how to deal with exceptions and error conditions. Okay, so use of simulators to sort of provide a safe environment to try and deal with some of these exceptions and emergencies. But also we picked up on this mental rehearsal technique where some of the studies, pilots were given the opportunity to sort of mentally rehearse, go through emergency procedures in the mind, use checklists to become familiar with the process. And then in the test exercises, the pilots who'd been given that opportunity performed significantly better than those pilots who hadn't. So again, it suggests that there may be something here in terms of learning from the aviation industry, where mental rehearsal could be a technique which helps us to keep our sort of frontline staff IT restart and recovery skills sort of honed and prepared when the opportunity to actually do this in the real environment is obviously reducing. So there's clearly a potential we can look at here. So quick situation appraisal reflection. So we started with the modern IT environment. We made a view that this could be an issue for skills degradation. We found lots of circumstantial evidence, but when we looked at a comparative organisation that had perhaps decades more experience of these sort of modern environments, we found this hard link. So the challenge, I guess, for us is, okay, so how do we provide practice? We perhaps don't have the luxury of simulators, and certainly our test environments may not be available or to the level of spec we would require to perhaps use those as a sort of a testing ground. Certainly getting our hands dirty on sort of failover procedures and sort of disaster recovery procedures where there's production outages, they're clearly going to be resisted, as typically today's modern digital world is 24/7. So actually this concept of mental rehearsal may be actually the only really viable option we have to provide that sort of practice where we can't provide it in the actual physical sense. So let's look at mental rehearsal in a bit more detail. So when we break it down, what are the sort of key principles behind it? How does it sort of work? Okay, so with mental rehearsal, we have a number of things that we can sort of apply. So we've got this concept of imagining. So again, you know, being placed in a particular situation. So you're in a situation and then visualizing then how you would deal and how you respond to that particular situation. And then thinking about, so what are the sort of issues that require you to take action? What sort of actions would you take? What decisions need to be made? And then anticipating, having made maybe some particular decisions, what potential issues might arise and how we might mitigate or sort of countermeasure those. And then this thing around observation, which I mentioned earlier, observing. So one of the things with mental rehearsal is the observation sense, where we can look at what good looks like and sort of say, well, how can we adopt that? And how can we sort of take that approach? How can we adopt and adapt that and think about how we might follow that approach? So again, an opportunity for learning. So these are the sort of key principles of mental rehearsal. I guess if we're going to use these in any sort of sensible way, in terms of the approach for sort of our overall approach to IT service continuity management, then we need to look at methods and ways that these become actually practical, viable, and also I think to be raised to what I would call the collective level. Okay, so when we've talked about mental rehearsal so far, it's been very much at an individual level. So how can we take those sort of concepts and actually make an approach which is something that works at the collective level rather than just individuals? And so to do that, we've identified initially sort of 5 fairly practical approaches where we can use the principles of mental rehearsal in sort of methods and approaches that we can apply at both an individual but importantly a collective level. So we'll look at 3. There is information as a sort of an appendix at the end of the presentation deck. And as I said before, if you want more information on these in detail, then I'll give you my contact details. So let's have a look at some of these. So we start with what I call the what if type of workshop. So this is a workshop approach, and typically the workshop starts with a scenario, a recovery scenario, where we've got sort of existing standard operating procedures. So there'd be no real value in bringing a lot of people together for what's already recognized as an issue that already has predefined procedures. But we apply what I call Murphy's Law. And Murphy's Law is if it can go wrong, it will go wrong. So what if one of the inputs to a particular recovery isn't available? Yeah, it's either been deleted or it's corrupted, you know, for whatever reason, one of the key inputs to that recovery activity you've got an issue with. And what if part of the recovery environment isn't available? Okay, so maybe there are files you need that you can't access, maybe because of a different issue. Okay, and we keep unfolding these changing sort of sequences of events. So from a mental rehearsal perspective, we're already starting to get people to imagine being in this situation, thinking about, you know, the actions that they would take, starting to anticipate these sort of issues or problems that might occur. And to me, a good analogy for this is replacing a flat tire. Yeah, let's follow the standard procedure. Get the car handbook out of the glove box, and that's fine. And we've probably done this many times ourselves. Yeah, bit inconvenient, not great, but we feel comfortable with the process. But what if you've got no spare tire? Okay. Uh, well, I can maybe get, my son can perhaps get a tire from a garage and bring one or whatever. Yeah. But you've got no car jack. Yeah. And if you've got no car jack, well, what are you going to do about that? And even if you got a car jack, you haven't got a wheel brace. Now, actually, 10 years ago, it was not uncommon for modern car manufacturers, and to a certain degree, they still do it now, not to provide spare tire or the equipment that goes with it. Simply, all you get would be an inflator and maybe some adhesive to plug a hole in the tire to get you to a garage. Yeah, which is all well and good unless you've got a massive big hole and the stuff just comes flowing out. Okay, so this was a process I went through for what started off as a standard operating procedure, and I learned a hell of a lot about how I would deal with a flat tire if I got one again with that particular car. And what I saw when we did the research was that there were lots of examples where what started off as standard recovery scenarios ended up being quite difficult, where the recovery in some way was compromised, either through human error, files being deleted, unable to get access to key files, or part of that recovery platform was also compromised. I also saw, for example, some instances where the fault tolerant technology itself had failed. And of course, there were no recovery procedures for that because, of course, it was designed never to fail. Uh, one of the big sort of headline examples of this was in the UK a few years ago, when a UK bank had a major issue with its job scheduler. And I know this is Anna's sort of space. It wasn't an IBM product, I believe, at the end of the day. However, they were trying to do an upgrade. There were some problems. They went to back out, recover the database, and found they couldn't. And then for those who are familiar with the big IBM mainframe shops, particularly in banking, lots and lots of batch work. They'd lost the ability to understand what had run, what hadn't run, and the consequence was customer sort of accounts. Their balances were not reliable and trustworthy for something like 6 weeks as they missed processing out. They duplicated processing, a real bit of a pig's mess, really, to be honest. And they got fined something like, I think was it 56 million pounds by the regulator. So these things can happen. Of course, it'd be nice for me to say, if they'd had a what if workshop for this type of scenario, then they would have been in a much better position. It would have taken a long time to recover, but they would have worked out what to do. And it is recoverable, but it takes a bit of time. But it's far better to have that in your back pocket than perhaps be facing this completely cold in the spotlight of a major incident. So again, from a recovery perspective, what if can be quite powerful, particularly in driving those cognitive skills for situations that typically, hopefully, you won't come across, but occasionally you will. The other area we looked at in terms of how can we use exercises to drive the sort of mental rehearsal concepts was with war games. Sometimes you might refer to them as walkthroughs, and I'd be surprised if organizations don't do these to keep a degree of familiarity with those sort of emergency procedures, which typically, again, we hope we never use. But we need to be aware where they are, who needs to do what, etc., etc. So, disaster recovery plans and business continuity plans, etc., etc. Now, when we looked at the aviation industry and some of the studies they did, one of the things they brought out around these sort of walkthroughs and exercises, which of course are performed in the aviation industry, was that they quite often didn't reflect and have a degree of realism. Okay, so one of the things we suggest in the approach here is, for example, don't give prior notification. Yeah, because if you do, so we've got a war game, a walkthrough scheduled in 7 days' time. The people who are invited will prepare for it. That isn't reality. And when the experts sort of rock up to the walkthrough exercise, maybe politely turn them away and say, send some of your junior staff. Because I guarantee most people who involved in major incidents will have been in a situation at some point when the only person who understands why something is the way it is, the only person who's ever seen this before, the only person who knows what to do is on holiday. Okay, so again, bring some realism. And when we look at these sort of scenarios for these sort of walkthroughs and war games, again, one of the observations is that often your emergency procedures are written from the perspective of invocation. So something's happened, so now let's follow the invocation procedure. Okay, so this is a comment from a data center manager, I'll keep him anonymous, who made the point that the easiest decision when it comes to invoking DR is when you've got a tail fin sticking out of the ground where your data center used to be. That's not really a great scenario for a war game to understand your organization's ability to handle what could be a major disaster. So the war games need to, again, drive that cognitive thinking, drive those mental rehearsal sort of, if you like, aspects. So what we need to do is create walkthroughs of war games that perhaps are difficult, are problematical, where actually using emergency procedures could be difficult. We might need to consider whether or not we could avoid using those procedures. So an example could be your data center's on fire. Well, the data hall's fine. It's at the other end of the building. The fire brigade are in place. They're trying to keep it under control. Yeah. Or your data center is close to a big industrial estate and there's been some sort of corrosive gas cloud that's escaped from a factory and it's heading your way. If that gets into your data center, it's going to cause quite a lot of damage to your kit. These are real situations, actually, that didn't involve invoking disaster recovery, believe it or not, but really, really tested the organization's ability to think about how they could manage those situations with, obviously, the emergency procedures in the back pocket should they be required. And what comes out of these exercises is actually a real understanding of the things you might need to add and append to your emergency procedures to deal with these sort of, situations. Because most most disaster recovery scenarios start with an incident, usually start with a call to the service desk saying, I can't log in. Yeah. At the backdrop, you've got some of these things happening. So a lot of great learning and a lot of better familiarity with the overall approach to invocation comes from these sort of approaches to your war games. And then the final area we looked at in this session is what we call gamification, which is perhaps a fancy word for business simulations and business simulation games. So they do say that children learn from play, and actually adults can learn from play. So these business simulations are typically a game based around gaming rules. So there'll be goals to achieve to win the game. There'll be teams involved and roles involved in helping to play the game to get to the right result. These business simulations typically are about a business challenge which is quite far removed from the day job, such as Apollo 13. Houston, we have a problem. However, the game requires you to apply IT best practices to try and achieve, the goals of the game. Quite often, a lot of these games require roles to be applied. Okay, so again, as a hint and tip, typically, if the role requires a service desk manager, don't give it to the service desk manager. Give it to the technical support guy. And if it requires a technical support guy, maybe give it to the problem manager. And if we need a problem manager, give it to the capacity manager. So put people in a slightly uncomfortable position where they're actually performing a role which is not close to their day job. But the benefit of this is it helps to improve that overall mental representation of how the IT organizations should plug together and work together when dealing with sort of failure situations. Okay, so in the marketplace, there's quite a number of these different business simulation games. They all have a particular theme, whether it's improving a pizza business or building the pyramids. And they all have a particular leaning towards a particular best practice in IT that can be applied. So the ones we sort of pick out for that sort of major incident focus, IT restart and recovery, would be Apollo 13 and Operation Aftermath. So these are commercially available as sort of one-day events that can be facilitated with your teams. And I made a point before about observation. So one of the big benefits of these games is that observation plays hopefully quite an important, lasting sort of benefit. Said before, people are performing in roles that might not be close to the day job, but by doing that, they start to understand how the different roles interact. Yeah, how in their day job they should be interacting with maybe the service desk, or maybe the capacity management team, or maybe problem management. And by being part of a team, performing these roles, looking at results, working together as a team to make improvements, to then improve the next run of the game, and so on and so forth. They see how working together as a team helps to achieve results. And often in the workplace, this sort of holistic sort of mental representation of how the organization should plug together and work together is often difficult. And so that's one of the benefits I hope you take back into the day job, is that better understanding of when things happen, that we better understand how we should all be working and operate. We understand the requirements and needs of all the different factions involved in trying to recover a major issue. Okay, so we've looked at mental rehearsal. We've looked at the techniques that we've been able to, I think, drive through those approaches. And the benefit, hopefully you've seen, is that we've created, I guess, what we call safe learning environments, where we've really presented, attendees with, situations where they've had to imagine being involved, they've had to visualize how they would perform, they've had to think about how they're going to deal with some difficult situations. They've had to then try and anticipate maybe issues. And we've also seen how these provide a great environment for observation. This could be junior staff, who improve their mental representation of stuff because they've observed how things have been performed, or indeed senior, experienced people in business simulations. They observe how the organization could work better because we've understood the different roles and needs and requirements in a much better way. So let's look at a bit of a summary. So in an environment where practice and execution is reducing, so we've shown those three examples to drive that cognitive critical sort of thinking sort of skill set, using those principles of mental rehearsal. So if we summarize, I would say I think we've seen that skills can degrade over time through lack of practice and execution. I think that's been absolutely validated from the experiences within the aviation industry. Lots and lots of studies have proved that, validated that, and even today it is still a major concern that the industry is trying to wrestle with. The modern IT environment will continue to evolve and exploit automation, artificial intelligence, machine learning. Okay, so the opportunity for human involvement in stuff will get less and less, and so that opportunity to practice and execute, particularly around restart and recovery, will reduce. Of course, Murphy's Law still applies. Yeah, it doesn't matter how resilient your technology is, doesn't matter how fault tolerant it is, things will occasionally go wrong. So we have to be ready and prepared, from a sort of a cognitive skill perspective to deal with that. So we need to think about alternative approaches to be ready and prepared. And I think some of those mental rehearsal techniques and methods we've explained certainly can put people in a better place in dealing with these infrequent but hard-hitting exceptions that will occur in the IT infrastructure. And so I guess lastly, some food for thought. So as I say, we will as an industry continue to exploit automation and AI, greater use of machine learning. So some food for thought from the aviation industry. And those sort of closing comments were from an experienced airline pilot. And these were made after some fairly major airline disasters in 2019. There were two Boeing 737 MAX failures, which resulted in a large loss of life. Quite close to each other, it resulted in the actual airline itself, the plane being grounded for some 12 to 18 months. automation and the fact that pilots couldn't understand and didn't understand what automation was doing, they didn't know how to override it, was seen as a key factor in those two instances. So it makes the point, I guess, that as we become more and more sort of dependent, and we exploit more and more sophisticated sort of applications of automation, is there a tipping point where, as a human, we no longer have the ability to actually understand when automation isn't working, and what to do if indeed it fails? So again, just food for thought on this topic, and you are part of the automation stream in the conference, so I'll leave that as a lasting thought. Okay, so thank you for attending. If this is of interest, there is a detailed paper on request. Okay, so if you wanted to know a bit more about war games and how to set them up, and you know, about what if workshops and the approach to take in designing those, etc., etc., then there is a detailed paper available on request, either through my email or through my LinkedIn. Okay, so I think the chair will reinforce this, but please make sure you submit your session feedback. They say feedback is a gift, so please do that. And also make sure you, if you can, have the opportunity to contribute to the charity of the year, which I think is the NHS this year for GSE UK. Okay, so Anna, can I hand back to you now?
Of course, I need to unmute first. Okay, so there's been a very interesting in the group chat, but no specific questions. What I have done is I have given people the ability to unmute themselves. So if they have any questions, or you know, if they have any points they want to bring across on this, please do. And as Ian pointed out, yes, we do have a charity. Yes, we would like you to put a small contribution in appreciation of all the work that's gone into putting the conference together, so that we can make a nice donation at the end of it. Normally we have good raffles and things on the face-to-face, but unfortunately that's not a possibility at the moment. But please do make a donation, and please make feedback. Please feedback on the session, either through the QR code, through the link, through the bring your own agenda tile for the meeting. There's an area where you can click to go in and do some feedback on the session. That's greatly appreciated, both by the session, you know, both by Ian, he'll be able to see the feedback, and also by us for next year's conference. So if anybody's got anything they would like to say it. And you have had another thanks, a really useful presentation from Eileen.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. Well, I appreciate people getting up early to dial in. As I say, first session of the day, there's always a good excuse not to do it, but yeah. Okay, so I got a question from M. Fitzgerald. Have you found different thinking in different countries? Have I found different thinking in different countries? Interesting question. I think from the aviation studies, clearly a lot of the observations around pilot skills and pilot skills degradation affect the industry as a whole. So again, you know, if you were looking at the scope of the studies and the flights and accidents that have been behind them, then they've occurred all over the globe. So as a phenomena, if you want to call it that, then certainly in the aviation industry, it's an issue that is pervasive. From an IT perspective, as I say, when I looked at the industry surveys and the sort of journals, again, A lot of those were, sort of global. So one of the studies is, in fact, a global IT study from respondents from all over the world. So again, whilst we said it was circumstantial, this, human error being the number one cause or risk is coming out from what appear to be global surveys. So I'm assuming there's respondents from again many different countries in the world. So yeah. So I don't know if I can answer that question directly as an absolute yes. What I would say in terms of my observations of the studies and the factors behind them, and the surveys and the sort of respondents, then they do reflect a more global perspective than just say me or the UK. Hope that's okay, Mr. Fitzgerald. Human error is factored after automation have failed. Would that be true? Not necessarily. I think there's a number of things with human error and automation, which clearly, when I think when automation fails, I say one of the real consequences of that is people have not seen or done maybe a manual activity before, so that would be true. I think sometimes as well that if we look at the broader topic, which is low characteristics of failure, that then human error can occur through just lack of practice. Say human error is quite a broad church. When we look at sort of things behind it, it can be never seen this before, so I'm really sort of flying by the seat of my pants, pardon the pun, or I've been given, I've seen an error message and I've just interpreted it the wrong way. It could be, it could be lack of training. It could be an individual's going through a particular, personal domestic problem, and it's sort of fogged the mind. So there's a whole range of reasons for human error. But automation failing is clearly one of them, but not, I would say, necessarily the only one. Hope that answers your question. Okay, so it looks like the airwaves are slowing down now, Anna.
Yeah, no, I thought it was interesting that rather than just saying it's human error, you go to the cause of the human error, which is something that isn't always done. So I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, I think it's, we talk about no blame culture, but I'm not sure within IT we're quite there yet. I think if we can sort of hunt the guilty and hang the innocent, quite often we'll do that simply because, it's human error. So quite often, in my experience, we'll have, major incidents or problems closed as human error, and it's or even actually, and being an operator, I know where we fit in the food chain. Quite often there's almost like a subcategory called operator error, which is the lowest of the low, and we sort of leave it at that and we put it down to just incompetency. Whereas I think you can learn from the aviation industry, which they take the view, if someone's made a mistake, they're highly skilled, trained people. Why have they done that? Something must have been a contributory factor, and that's what they need to understand, which I think is probably a general learning we could take, perhaps, and apply in IT anyway, when we find that we've had people making mistakes, that we don't just write it off as human error and implied incompetency.
Okay, well, if no one has anything else, then again, a reminder to do feedback, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Okay, same too. Thanks, Anna. Thanks for the chair, and thank you for everyone who attended. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.